Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. As we head into the Bitcoin singularity, it's the single most important thing to ever happen to humanity since the creation or invention or discovery of fire. Stacey?
You know, to see us through this hardening event, this hardening of money coming, because what we're seeing in all of this chaos happening over the past, well, few years, but especially accelerating over the past 6 months since the Fed started intervening in the repo market, and then we got hit by a pandemic, and now we have mass unemployment and things like that. That's the fiat system leaving, and this is the hardening system, the hard money system entering. And to join us through this time, we have Guillermo, who we met in Mexico City, CDMX. He was so wise, and he told us about hard money. So, and he's actually pretty hard. If you pick him up, he's really hard. Unlike Plucky, who we took with us through the central banking fiat.
Plucky is quarantining.
He's quarantining, but he's really floppy. You know, he could barely stand
He's the
up.
world's famous central banker.
He's the most famous central banker, but this is hard money era. So we have a stone skull headed, just like your jacket. We've been signaling this. So we have Guillermo to join us to talk about brace for the deepest recession on record, says Bank of America analysts as jobless claims surged to 6.6 million. They believe that unemployment rate is going to go to 15.6%, up from 3.5% in February. So that's a huge rise in unemployment rate. We haven't seen this in our lifetimes, this sort of surge this rapidly.
Well, even the 3.5% unemployment rate is a bogus number. You know, they don't count people who have stopped looking for work, and they don't count all kinds of people in that number. The actual number is a lot higher. All the government published numbers are fantasy numbers, and we live in a fantasy economy ever since 1971, when we went off a currency that had some relation to gold to pure fiat money currency. The first time in global history we've had a global economy run entirely on fantasists, printing coupons and then pretending that they have some kind of backing, and the numbers are meaningless. So if the unemployment rate is 15%, 20%, 30%, it's kind of meaningless because these are mostly gig jobs anyway that don't pay enough to survive on. You need 2 or 3 of these jobs. And the whole problem is not work, because work is unneeded. Taxes are unneeded, and earnings for corporations are also unneeded. You don't need any of that stuff. If I can just call up the European Central Bank and say, hello, I run LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet, Hennessy. I'd like to buy Tiffany's, and I don't want to pay any money for it. I want you to give me the money, European Central Bank, and I want to own it as a gift from you and all the people you represent in the ECB. And the ECB goes, yes, sir. Here it is. We're going to wire the money right away. And they gifted this guy at Louis Vuitton, Moet, Hennessy. They gifted him Tiffany as a gift, you know, from European. Look it up. You know, this is that. You think some slob working at McDonald's is going to be able to call up the ECB and say, oh, hello, I'd like to buy Tiffany. No, that's not going to work, is it?
I have no idea why you did that in a British accent. It was, in fact, a French guy, Pinot, who received that money, or Arnaud. That was kind of the peak of that fiat era. So here we have this Great Depression-looking numbers and the unemployment numbers, and Bank of America sees 15.6% unemployment. So that system is looking degraded and sick. And in fact, sick is in the first words here of this tweet. Does this chart make anyone else sick? Fed balance sheet rockets up, corporate earnings going straight down. Further evidence we don't live in a capitalistic society. Last 4 decades of extreme leverage to conceal declining productivity to enrich a small elite on full display. So as we've been covering here on the Keiser Report, earnings have been declining for years now, but it's been made up for by, on the one hand, stock buybacks, where the shareholders are losing, basically, and the company is losing because it's losing its cash, its access to cash. It's taking its cash off its balance sheet and turning it into free money for the corporate elite at the company, and thus basically ravaging their balance sheets. And we see that now because they've spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the past few years, and now they're requiring trillions of dollars of bailout. In fact, they've spent over $4 trillion in the last 5 years on stock buybacks, and now they require a bailout for that amount. But also, the Fed money printing has caused the inflation, which causes their stock price to rise. It's always covering up this huge decline in earnings.
And do they have Bitcoin derangement syndrome? Are the CEOs of these companies, including Warren Buffett, are they just doing something that's patently moronic? to destroy themselves and their country and the economy and fiat money? Or has the Bitcoin protocol, which I believe is self-aware and is part of the SETI project from the 1990s, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, remember, was the first massively parallel computer project that went out there looking for other forms of consciousness. That worked because it gave birth to Bitcoin in 2009 as part of the SETI project. And we have alien intelligence reaching out to our global unconscious and destroying people like Warren Buffett on the unconscious level, who is actively pursuing the fiat money delusion. And the halving is coming in May, and it's the quantum hardening event. And we're entering the Bitcoin singularity in 2020. We're entering the Bitcoin singularity in the second quarter of 2020.
Well, speaking of that, you've signaled to the audience what's coming next in this tweet from Adam Back. Bitcoin halving is quantitative hardening. Fiat undergoing lots of politically driven quantitative easing. Bitcoin supply algorithm starts quantitative hardening next month. As we've mentioned many times over the past few years, we're entering in the fourth turning. These are big seismic shifts of like collapses of empires and the rise of new powers. The end of a powerful generation, and the boomers were powerful simply through sheer numbers. We have these new generations of Millennial and Z coming on who are bigger than the generation before them of boomers and X that everybody forgets. But nevertheless, we have these seismic shift coming up, radical shift, and the end of a fiat regime and the emergence of something new will have to replace it. It's a hardening that will happen, and we'll see what happens there.
Bitcoin is absolute scarcity, which is before Bitcoin unknown. But you don't have that with gold. Gold is, you never know. I mean, it's always a new supply of gold, and they could start mining gold from asteroids or from seawater, and it's not absolute scarcity. Bitcoin is absolute scarcity that you can use as the hardest money ever known in humanity. And that means that you have the possibility to absolutely transition the global unconsciousness from being buried under an egocentric, consciousness-driven parade of egomaniacs and plunderers like Arnaud at LVMH or Jamie Dimon or Lloyd Blankfein, to a sentient consciousness around altruism and love. I mean, this is the ushering in of love, is the Bitcoin transformation singularity.
You talk about that LVMH deal, and I said that that was sort of a signal for the end of that fiat regime. The other thing that we've seen over the past, 10 years has been fracking, and that was also, it's a real substance. You can't have GDP growth. You can't have an economy without energy. You need energy as an input to develop goods and services around the world. And yet here, something real met the enormity of the fakeness, right? The end of fiat regime, where it never made money, okay? Fracking never, ever made money. It wasn't making money at $100 a barrel. It certainly wasn't making money at $10 a barrel. You're starting to see companies like Whiting, a huge fracking outfit, go bust. So you're starting to see that. But the other number that was interesting is, people kept pouring money into it. Like investors kept pouring money into it, even though it was never making money. That it was a black hole, just a collapsing black hole of oily debt, and ever increasing amount of people willing to invest in it. But the demand for oil is now down 25% in the past month. So just like unemployment numbers shooting up, we see the collapse in the demand for oil down 25%. And yet those frackers, because they keep on needing to make their interest payments on their bond payments, they've been like pumping and pumping and pumping all the way down. And the people at the running the pipelines and the tanks are saying, stop, basta, enough. Guillermo is telling them enough.
Yeah, the frackers are able to beat a dead horse more even than Hillary Clinton. That's how messed up in the head they are. As we've said on this show for many years, people say, I hear what you're saying on the Kaiser Report, and sometimes it seems one step removed from what I would conceive as being a practical day-to-day knowledge that I could use. But look at the fracking story we've been covering now for almost 10 years. We've said for 10 years, A, it costs more energy to go in than you get out, and it costs more cash that goes in than come out. It's cash flow negative, and that it's only there to generate fees for the bond sellers who work on Wall Street to perpetrate this massive fraud called American shale industry. We've been saying that for 10 years. Now, the reality of that delusion is hitting home. But for anyone who's surprised by this or losing money on this, it's too bad on them, because we were very explicit in explaining to them that to invest in fracking at any point over the last 10 years would be like picking Hillary Clinton to win the next presidential election.
This was only possible in that old regime. We are exiting the easy money regime, and we're entering in a hardening regime, because everything has changed. Nothing can ever be the same. So that sort of fantasy that, remember those headlines on like Newsweek or Time magazine saying we're bigger than Saudi Arabia of oil. And the fact is we were never. It was all a fantasy. It was a fiction. It was a Hollywood film, because if we could crumble like that and disintegrate into dust in the Texas desert at the cost of once oil goes under $20. And speaking of Hollywood, that takes me to the holing, not the happening. This is the holing of box office in Hollywood. The domestic box office movie theaters brought in a whopping $5,179 for the week of March 20th to the 26th, down 100% from $204,193,406 the same week a year ago. Those numbers are just incredible, he says.
Hollywood films are like fracking. It's been around for 100 years, and it's always been a losing business, right? The films in the studios the box office is a loss leader. They don't make money.
It's a tax fraud
for
them.
It's a tax fraud.
It's just like you were saying there with all the LVMH and the getting the
right
ECB.
Before there was Enron, there was Hollywood accounting. That's what they called the Enron accounting. As a matter of fact, when I worked on Hollywood Stock Exchange, the executive who came to work for me at HSX was going to go to Enron, but then Enron went to zero. And then he was working at Sony Television. He was going to go to Enron because they were working on the fantasy that was their business model. And instead, he came to the Hollywood Stock Exchange. Right, Andy? All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to the first and the best since 2011, the finest investment banking in Bitcoin and crypto, from Bank to the Future, Simon Dixon. Simon, welcome back.
Thanks for having me in these troubled times.
So, Simon Dixon, we are seeing trillions upon trillions of bailout money and quantitative easing being thrown around. What sort of money is being printed? What sort is not being printed? And who will benefit most?
Because everyone's so preoccupied with the health crisis right now, and people have got other things on their mind, and people are in situations of desperate need at the moment. The government is throwing everything they've got at it. And I guess they have no choice but to throw everything they've got. But at some point, the flow of funds and the financial crisis is going to become a reality after we get through this health crisis. And so what we're seeing right now is, in other times of crisis, for example, the American Civil War, government simply printed new money called the greenback, which is essentially debt-free money that was introduced into the economy. But what we're seeing right now is that the government is using quantitative easing, where essentially the central bank is buying government debt. And then that government debt is going to be used for all the different packages that they need to put together, including helicopter money. When really, why did they need to borrow that in the first place, and why couldn't they just introduce that? We're getting lots of interesting questions. They were debating whether accounts for these individuals were going to actually be created directly at the Fed, giving individuals the ability to have a Fed account, which really got a lot of pushback from, obviously, the banking community that would much rather this be created in the normal way, business as usual, with the bank in the middle. So the flow of funds are going to really unquestionably have so many consequences, especially as we enter into the inevitable financial crisis after we get through this health crisis challenge.
Well, the question people always had about the dollar or any fiat money, starting back in 1971 when the world went on a pure fiat money standard for the first time in history, the question was always, well, what backs this fiat money And we'd hear from policymakers a lot of convoluted theories about economic schools and policies. Now in 2020, we know that nothing backs the greenbacks, the fiat money. It's just printed out of thin air, like many of us have been saying for years now. That's no longer an allegation or a theory. It's obviously true. One big question people are asking is, well, now that we know that the money is simply printed out of thin air and it's backed by nothing, why do we pay taxes at all, Simon Dixon? This is a question that's stoking people to rise up, and there's a lot of social unrest out there because people realize that taxes are a scam, that there's nothing backing the fiat money, and so why even collect taxes, Simon Dixon?
Well, this is going to lead to undoubted questioning of everything. So this is really, I don't want to be dramatical, but this is a global reset in the financial system as a result of so much happening as a result of this. You know, people are going to be asking questions that they had not necessarily asked before. Even the government can ask the question of why do we need to borrow it through the bond market and factor interest into these repayments when simply we could have just created it direct without the Federal Reserve in the middle. Individuals are going to be asking the question, well, you know, why bother paying taxes in these scenarios when we can see that the government's going to have to bail out anyway? Individuals are also going to be asking the question, which is what inevitably will lead to the financial crisis of, well, when I get my helicopter money, and I've got my income right now, the last thing I want to do is use that to pay my mortgage in a time when I probably can't be repossessed. So people are going to be thinking of their own livelihood and their own personal situation and conserving cash. And that will inevitably lead to mass defaults in mortgages, which then leads to the collapse of the fractional reserve banking system. And then inevitably a bailout, which I'm forecasting will be the central bank or the government creating their own digital currency and essentially allowing banks to go bust without people losing their money by giving them the ability to open a wallet with the central bank. If they had $10,000 in their account, they then can open that with the central bank. And I think that we're going to see a real attack from central banks on traditional banks as we inevitably experience the ginormous consequences of essentially the world's largest regulated Ponzi scheme that we've seen in our lifetime called fiat currency and banking.
You have a background in banking. You've been a Bitcoin and crypto banker since 2011. You wrote the book, Bank to the Future, and you outlined a lot of these issues with banks, and you've been studying money for decades now. I want to ask you a theoretical question and get your thoughts. In my view, as you've described the situation with all this money printing and debt monetization, and the government and the central bank taking control of the majority of the sovereign bond market, the majority of the corporate bond market, the majority of the mortgage-backed security market, and the majority of the stock market, are we not setting ourselves up for what some might call like neo-feudalism, where you've got a few central authorities with 99.8% of all stocks and bonds in existence, and then everyone else is living essentially like a peasant? So you just have peasants and lords. I mean, think about that for a second. I'll move on. I got some other questions. So the Bitcoin halving arrives next month, Simon Dixon. Some call it quantitative tightening. Each block will be reduced to 6.25 Bitcoin from 12.5 Bitcoin. In rewards, tell us what you expect from this, Simon.
So we're going to see a two-tiered economy. It's just what we're experiencing right now. We're seeing ever more control and something that looks increasingly more like communism from traditional fiat money, as the government is essentially leveraging these assets and balance sheets in order to actually accumulate all the world's assets. And you know, in this situation, I don't think they have any other choice either. So essentially, we're going to see this two-tiered economy. I mean, next is inevitable that people are going to need to get vaccines when that comes through. That might also lead to RFID chips being implanted and implemented so that the government can contract and control who's allowed out of their houses, and all these things that are going to happen as a result of this health crisis, which is going to be integrated into their central bank digital currency, where governments all around the world are going to be scrambling and fighting to claim that you should be paying their tax because you live in one country, but you did the deal on Zoom globally in another country, and two governments believe that they should be automatically collecting tax on that money. So you're going to end up with a very, very horrible, worse version of fiat currency to the one that we have now created through banks as debt. On the flip side, you've got Bitcoin, which is a fixed money supply, the ability to own your own money, the ability to spend your own money, and a monetary policy that can never change based upon maths and code. So people are going to have these choices as fiat currency gets worse and worse, but obviously has the stability that in a very unstable market like today allows you to spend the goods. But people are going to be, you've got this opposite effect where people are going to be experiencing, well, when the government make cash illegal because it might contain the virus, how is that going to affect that I can't control my money? It's all going to be done digitally. And people are going to be able to contrast these effects when they try and send it to a Bitcoin exchange and the bank says you can't send it. People are going to learn for the first time. Kraken had a 98% increase in USD deposits at their exchange because people are exiting fiat and putting that in Bitcoin. And this is exactly what Bitcoin was designed for, to give people this two-tiered economy as fiat currency exercises more and more influence and control and highlights the flaws in fiat currency, and people can experience Bitcoin, which is the exact opposite effect of some of the challenges that they'll be experiencing with fiat.
It's interesting that Bitcoin, one of the layers in the stack of the Bitcoin protocol is the game theory layer. So the incentives are so finely balanced in the protocol that this very elegant game theory emerges. And we've seen it jump from the minor players from 10 years ago to the countries on a sovereign level. The miners in different countries were dominating mining for a while, then that shifted back and forth to different countries. Now, as we head into May of 2020, and you have a full-on global fiat currency nightmare, and the Bitcoin is happening, it seems as though the Bitcoin is almost self-aware to some degree, and that it's happening exactly at the right moment to game theoretically attack fiat. Like, it's almost as if Bitcoin was born to go to war with fiat on the highest possible level, on the sovereign level. So to lay this out a little bit, you're suggesting that the central banks of the world, they go digital as a way to exert more control. And you're saying essentially it's a model of communism or Sovietization of the global economy, total top-down control vis-a-vis digital currency, which opens up the possibility of multiple regions taxing people from different countries, which is another nightmare. Concurrently, Bitcoin takes a quantum leap through the halvening. It's already the hardest money ever known to humanity, and to own it is an act of civil disobedience. Would you agree that owning Bitcoin and buying Bitcoin is equivalent to civil disobedience, Simon?
Well, really, it's an exit from the traditional financial system. On my YouTube channel about 2010, I created a video called The Great Depression of 2020s. And really, I was just following the trends that the fiat currency is a Ponzi scheme, and therefore it inevitably ends up in this scenario. Now, I didn't know what the event would be that would expose the weakness in the traditional financial system, but I said it would be a black swan event, and it will expose the systemic risk in the financial system. Now, obviously, there was a financial crisis at the time, and they used financial engineering in order to create the largest, an incredible bull market that was 100% fabricated upon financial engineering, injecting money into different markets. And at the same time, Bitcoin was born. The video I think I created was just around the exact same time that Bitcoin was born. We first met at that conference in Prague, where we discovered that. And really, these were the conversations that were being had, that there is going to become a time and a place in the world where people need an exit from the traditional financial system. And to me, I see this as really a force that the world is actually going to need, as something that actually gives people the choice that they need. Obviously, Bitcoin is not good for paying your rent and your mortgage because of the price fluctuations. But we live in a world where these types of volatility and price fluctuations are becoming an inevitable part of everything that we do in a world of deflationary events like this that inevitably lead to hyperinflation as you have to resolve this. And you're going to need to reset the financial system and use financial engineering that will inevitably lead to a more controlled, tighter version of fiat money and a world that we're not used to living in.
A good point about the volatility. Everyone was complaining about Bitcoin volatility, and then the stock market said, hey, hold my beer. All right, so Simon Dixon, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me, Max.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Simon Dixon, CEO and co-founder of Bank to the Future. If you want to contact us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.